The representation of LGBT Americans and the communities in which they reside has been changing drastically over the last decade. This newly emergent minority group and the way in which they vote and participate in government has opened an entirely new political atmosphere. Now, moving on to the gap in literature and LGBT representation, researchers would use prior knowledge and research material as to how LGBT communities vote in more liberal tendencies that is studied in Rights or Benefits, explaining the sexual identity gap in American political behavior. They have proven that the voting habits of LGBT communities swayed toward the Democratic Party. However, we still do not know how and to what extent the LGBT communities are representative in conservative arenas. How are LGBT communities living in historically known red states represented if the red majority does not represent their needs and wants? How does the LGBT newly emergent minority group break the glass ceiling of minority oppression in order to be represented in their local, state, or national government? This gap would be so intriguing to investigate because the LGBT community is one of the newest emerging minority groups in the United States. It is my belief that the LGBT community has had an extreme amount of backlash against their beliefs and foundation of ideals from the majority, so much so that the moral ground in which the LGBT community has stood upon has been attacked so immensely that people have died for their community. For an example, the Orlando nightclub shooting. The data and information collected, in theory, would give us a detailed illustration on how this newly emergent minority group can change the political atmosphere of not only more liberal districts in which they may reside, but moreover, how they change or affect conservative districts that surround them. This would be especially imperative in understanding how the needs of LGBT individuals are met and how accurately they are represented when living in these liberal island, per se, districts with high LGBT community populations that are surrounded by a sea of conservative districts. We can use this information as a catalyst and compare the data with our prior knowledge of majority-minority intercommunication tendencies. This relationship was studied in contact, community, and context, and public attitudes towards gay men and lesbians. It displayed how more communication between the majority and the minority will result in an increased toleration from the majority. We can then take this data and analyze the power of toleration of the majority in connection with nearby LGBT communities as they communicate with the surrounding red districts. This communication and relationship might validate an opportunity for potential for more liberal voting habits in red districts, maybe ultimately leading to newly emergent swing districts. We can collect our data by looking at the election patterns of local and state governments, using Arizona as an example, because it is a historically known red state that is swinging in the last election in terms of being blue. We would then compare and track the numbers of Republican candidates versus Democratic candidates over the last 25 years in both elections of mayor, representatives, and senators. We are looking for rising Democratic candidates because, as we know, LGBT communities tend to vote in favor of the Democratic Party. I would also look at the amount of bills that have passed versus not passed through local governments that concern LGBT community rights and needs over the last 10 years in Arizona alone. Through all of this collection of data and research, I do believe we can fill that gap in LGBT representation and how LGBT communities are represented when surrounded or living in and residing in more conservative districts.